Hello, everyone. My name is Sada Salem, she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the We Act TCTAC. We're excited to have you all join us today for the We Act Organizational Growth, Building a Sustainable Future for Your Organization. We'll be joined today by Melissa Miles, Peggy Shepard, and Dwaign Tyndal to talk a little bit more about the organizational growth and also a special feature with our Director of Development, Morgan Fritz. So just some logistical things we want to go over before we get started is this meeting is being recorded, so we will be sending it out afterwards and it will sit on our website. Please keep yourself on mute while the presenters are speaking. If you have questions prior from when you registered, we have taken those into account, but if you have questions during, please do drop them in the chat. This is a panel and there will be a Q&A session afterwards, so please do drop your questions as they come to your mind in the chat. Also, during that Q&A, we will allow folks to raise their hand and we'll take you off mute to engage directly with the panelists. So look out for that. And just again, level setting, what is the TCTAC? As you all know, TCTAC is a program administered by the EPA, and it's the Environmental Justice Thriving Community Technical Assistance Center. We launched in October 2023. There's 16 centers across the United States. We sit for Region 2, serving primarily New York, New Jersey. We do have another TCTAC in our region who serves Puerto Rico and USVI. The TCTACs are really meant to support you all with your capacity needs, provide training such as the one tonight, and also allow you all to build your capacity to go for more federal, state, and local grants and philanthropic money to build environmental justice projects in your community. So I'm going to introduce our main organizer and our panelist for tonight, Ms. Melissa Miles. Melissa is an environmental and climate justice advocate who began her career as a community organizer while living in the environmental justice community in Newark, New Jersey. She holds a master's in anthropology from the New School, yet maintains that that the knowledge she has of EJ is rooted in her lived experience, the training she received from veteran organizers, and her accountability to her community. Melissa is the Executive Director of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, or NJEJA, an organization with a history of leadership in the local and national EJ movement. She is a recipient of the Governor's Environmental Excellence Award for her work on landmark environmental justice law in 2020. She serves as the co-chair of the NJDEP Environmental Justice Advisory Council, is the steering committee member of the Coalition of Healthy Ports, and Building Equity and Alignment for EJBE, and is the EJ Director for the NJ Reparation Council. Melissa is also a proud alumni of the inaugural cohort of the EJ Disrupt Design Fellowship of the Tishman Environment and Design Center in New Jersey School. But also I'll add that Melissa sits on the steering committee for the We Act TCTAC. So without further ado, I will pass it to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really appreciate you, and so happy to see so many names and faces of folks I know from New Jersey. Also happy to see so many folks who are on this webinar from all over the country. So thank you again, Sarah, for the introduction, for explaining to folks what the TCTAC is. Whether you're calling from Region 2 or another region, every region has a TCTAC. If you are not currently engaging with your TCTAC or Technical Assistance Center around your federal grant applications, please do, because they are definitely resources. So just to get us started, next slide, please. So just taking us back a little bit to 2021, when President Biden first introduced the Justice 40 initiative, which was sort of the springboard for many of the investments that we see in climate and infrastructure now. And we'll be talking about some of those investments and hearing from two anchor leaders in the field who are currently managing large federal grants as grassroots community-based EJ organizations. The Justice 40 initiative to me, what's most important about it is that it launched us on this path of a whole of government approach to funding for climate, with an emphasis on what the federal government calls disadvantaged communities. Many of us may call them EJ communities. In New Jersey, they're referred to as overburdened communities. There are different names, but these are the communities which have been historically divided by roadways, the sites of polluting industries, port adjacent, with heat island and flood effect, and a myriad of, environmental and climate disparities. So these are the communities that are really supposed to be receiving the benefits of climate investment in the country. As most of us know, benefits was not clearly defined, but what we do know is that this covers 8 categories, which are climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit, health, affordable and sustainable housing, training and workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and clean water and wastewater. Another thing that I really want to uplift is that Biden did not invent this. He did not come up with this on his own. That these words were in, Biden's mouth on that day is a result of many decades of advocacy on the part of communities and community-based organizations like We Act. So, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't out of nowhere. It was because a lot of groundwork had been laid to bring us to that moment. But as we mentioned, Justice 40 wasn't the entire solution. Next slide, please. So Justice 40 actually only covers certain climate invested related programs, right? So it's actually just a small part of a much larger pool of money, which is referred to often as mandatory or formula funding, which flows to states, tribes, and local governments. So, the organizations that we will hear from tonight are organizations that have really had their eye on the entire pot, and how, these investments will flow into communities or not flow into the projects that community organizations have prioritized or not, and are doing their part, both through advocacy and through action, to make sure that these investments, come into communities in an equitable and fair way. Next slide, please. So in case you didn't realize just how much funding we're talking about, because, often we hear like, this is unprecedented. We haven't seen this much investment since the New Deal. This may never come again. And just, to give some credit where credit is due, I myself really got involved in this conversation through Communities First Fund, and want to thank them for providing me with both the context and some of the slides that I'm using, as they've traveled the country, really trying to help organizations understand what this moment is about. So, because of, the work of anchor agent organizations and of folks like Communities First Fund, I was able to really tap into this in a way that I felt it was important that we get some of these groups who are handling these funds to talk to the rest of us about how they're doing it and how they are building out organizational infrastructure at the same time. But in terms of the types of funding that we're looking at, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're looking at 1.2 trillion total for things from everything from bridges and roads and railways to ports, airports, broadband, water infrastructure, power grids, EV buses, EV charging resilience, and more. And through the Inflation Reduction Act, 400 billion in climate and clean energy investment. So one of the big topics of conversation now is that first bullet point, which are the community change grants, which are currently open to the tune of 2 billion. But also, there are some other pots that, will be available for communities to touch through different programs and through different, coalitions with state and local agencies. So that context being set, the conversation we're about to see take place is really meant to help our grassroots frontline organizations understand what are some of the things that you need to do to be prepared. Now, granted, these are organizations that didn't start this preparation just last year. They've been sort of steadily building towards a point where they could manage large federal grants. But I think it's never too late, right? We all have to start somewhere. And then for those of us who may not be able to manage large federal grants, what are the things that we should be doing to build our organizations to that point? So with that, next slide, please. I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists today. First, starting with Dwaign Tyndal. Dwaign is the Executive Director of Alternatives for Communities and Environment, or ACE, out of Massachusetts. Dwaign has over 25 years of professional experience in economic development, community and neighborhood development, youth development, and workforce development. Throughout his professional experience, Dwaign has effectively led capable and diverse teams and has also been able to communicate complex public policies to various stakeholders to show how community-based partnerships can build stronger communities and empower residents and businesses to take active roles in their neighborhoods. Dwaign is on the board of the Climate Justice Alliance, the Right to the City National Board, the Board of Transportation for Massachusetts, or T for Mass, and the Board of Community Labor United. Our other panelist is Peggy Shepard. Peggy Shepard is co-founder and executive director of We Act for Environmental Justice and has a long history of organizing and engaging Northern Manhattan residents in community-based planning and campaigns to address environmental protection and environmental health policy locally and nationally. She has successfully combined grassroots organizing, environmental advocacy, and environmental health community-based participatory research to become a national leader in advancing environmental policy and the perspective of environmental justice in urban communities to ensure that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment extends to all. She has been named co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, as well as chair of the New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and was the first female chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She also serves on the executive committee of the National Black Environmental Justice Network and the board of advisors of the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health. So I would like to first off thank Peggy and Dwaign for being panelists today. Both of them have had enormous influence on my career and my trajectory in EJ. It's an honor to be here with them both. And with that, let's get it started. So we drew these questions from the questions that we received from our guests, you all today. So you may hear your question being asked. If you don't hear your question being asked in the course of this section of our agenda, please do utilize the chat. If there is time, we will also try to pull questions from there as well. So our first question for Dwaign is about grant funding for EJ activities, right? So we have in our TCTAC many smaller organizational groups who are not yet really familiar with the types of grant funding out there that they should be looking for and how they go about it. Could you tell us, what has been your, how have you gone about applying for and securing grant funding?
Um, I think ACE approaches, we try to diversify um, our buckets, our clean buckets, meaning that we do youth development, transportation, housing, public health. So we try to go after different funding. Like EJ is the gigantic umbrella of so many different issues. So the way we think about EJ and we think about transportation, we think about housing, we think about public health, we think about building emissions, like each of those areas are opportunities for us to target new funders, develop new relationship with new funders. And also it's opportunities for us to kind of develop the products and to kind of share those products with other partners, form coalitions, and basically just position ourselves to have opportunities to have conversations about potential resources coming back to our organizations. So when I talk about resources, I'm not just talking about like actual dollar amounts or greenbacks. I'm talking about how do we develop relationships, how do we develop social networks? How do we develop capacity through those coalition spaces to actually bring resources to our organization? So it's one part trying to get money, but it's also the other part of trying to develop the necessary relationships that could translate into not just money, but influence and power.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dwaign. So while we're talking about relationships, relationships as a form of resource, I'd like to move into a question about building relationships and partnerships. So for you, Peggy, when and how do you build relationships with other community-based organizations or private and public entities? What do those relationships look like? And how does that impact your ability to fundraise?
Well, I think you have to really understand what your objective is in your neighborhood or your town or city or state. When we got started, our objective was to ensure that environmental justice was on the agenda of New York City and New York State. And so to do that, you have to become known for your issue and you've got to promote the issue because very few people are talking about the issues that we are. And so joining advisory boards, joining community boards where you can begin to promote the issue and talk about the impact in neighborhoods, going to the town hall meetings, understanding and meeting the agency staff of the key city or state agencies that are important, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency or the Transportation Agency. Understanding how those agencies work, if those are part of your issue area, ensuring that you know the staff and they know you. Because once the agency staff know who you are, you're going to be on the list for their town hall meetings, for them reaching out. So again, really putting yourself in a space where you're known for the issue and you're known as a resource that can be reliable. So you should know who your elected officials are, know their staff. And really it depends on how all in you are. But if they're going to be policy meetings, you want to make sure you're in those meetings. And to do a lot of that means coalition building. It may mean joining networks where you might be a stranger. For instance, when we wanted to sort of get the idea of indoor air quality, on the minds of the housing activists, they talk about repairs, but they're not really talking about how the exposures that those problems have on health. And so we joined those networks just to begin to raise those issues so that we could work together and have a common vocabulary. So coalition building, network building is really important because we only have a stronger voice when we're speaking together in some sort of consensus. All of the things that Dwaign said earlier, you've got to have that foundation of strong networks and coalitions that can come together and help each other, and build the capacity and the resources, because none of us alone have enough resources to do what's necessary, whether it's financial or people resources.
Right. I think that I feel like I could, really continue just on this line of questioning about, um, building coalitions across sector, for the purpose of stronger EJ work. I feel like we could talk about this all evening. But as you were talking about, this is a form of building capacity. Dwaign, just shifting just a little bit to building organizational capacity, right? So we have questions around, building capacity and fundraising for general operating expenses, staff operations. Part of this conversation is about federal funding, which we know is largely restricted, right? It's programmatic funding. You only have a small percentage of a federal grant that you can use for your overhead. But in order to manage those grants, you have to have some organizational capacity. So what has been your strategy to actually building that organizational capacity?
Being very honest with funders. Many times funders will direct resources and make it very restrictive and really don't want to pay for the back end. So every opportunity that I can have a conversation with a funder, I remind them the importance of the back end of the organization. We are a smaller organization. We just under $1 million budget. We have like 8 and 7 staff, smaller organization. And as we was building it out, the back end meant as much as the programmatic piece of it. I wasn't going to let funders fund the fun stuff and then we die in the back end. So that's one issue. We need to have a different dialogue with philanthropy, how before we could step into this world of kind of like federal resources, which take tons, shouldn't say tons, but it takes more back end resources to manage. You need to start having different conversation with philanthropy on platforms, individuals. Like this is the real cost of doing business with 501(c)(3)s. It's kind of more intensive. A lot of times when people think about you have a nonprofit that is the paperwork is still there, the regulations are still there, the audits are still there. And those are the things that usually kind of break smaller nonprofit organizations. So I try to have that type of conversation to position for general operation resources and then show examples of when you fund general operations, it gives us a freedom to really go after the issues in real time. Like when many times we get kind of trapped into these funding cycles where you have to do one or a few things, the real opportunities may come over the horizon, but you don't have the resources to shift. So, I'm very honest with funders that I need some flexibility to be able to go after opportunities in real time. And general op funding is the way to go. Had some success to move it, but it's an ongoing process to have that conversation with funders with the importance of general ops.
Incredible, Dwaign. Thank you so much. And I have definitely seen organizations that approach funding with that type of attitude, that funders are partners, understanding that what we have is a product that they need for their portfolios and really not being willing to compromise on their values, in that conversation. And I have seen, a lot of success. I've seen organizations have a lot more success with that type of approach, than with an approach that, sort of defers to the funder as expert, right? And that's a whole other conversation, I think, about, really, what are the reasons why we sometimes may feel like we have less power in those types of conversations and relationships. But thank you so much for sharing your approach to building capacity through the private foundation sector. So in that same vein, once you have the funding, once you have the financial resources, there's a whole set of new issues that arise, right? That you've both been sort of referencing, which is how do you actually manage that money? Specifically, talking about federal money, where the regulations can be very, sometimes a little bit opaque. You have to really clarify and be very clear about what the expectations are with those pools of money, because there can be consequences when they're not managed properly. So Peggy, could you talk about what has been your experience with grant management and just back office management? Because of course grants are just part of it, but the technologies, the software, databases, financial systems, this is so much of what I found was missing in conversations between grassroots organizations. We were talking a lot about policy, which is amazing, a lot about organizing, but when it came to like, what are the systems do you have in place? Who was managing your finances and how are you actually tracking your grants and deliverables? There just didn't seem to be as much information. So could you talk a little bit about how We Act has excelled at that, to the point where you can now manage, these big federal grants?
Well, I think we all have to start with the understanding that you're starting a business. It's called nonprofit, but it's a business. You've got to pay rent. You've got to have the telephones on. You have a darn payroll where you might have liability for personnel issues. You've got to give people benefits. So you're starting a business, and that business has to have a solid structure, and you definitely have to have an accountant. I mean, that should probably be the second person you hire. You've got to have a good accountant. And so certainly when you're a smaller organization, you don't have as many, project grants to manage. So that makes it a little easier. But again, you need to have your audit, you need to have your 501c3 in place, and you need to begin to understand how to develop projects and also apportion staff time to those projects in a way that you can begin to subsidize other aspects of the organization. Sometimes you might have 4 projects and you're putting 10 or 20% of staff time on each one to ensure that you can get to 100% of salary for everyone. Sometimes some of the work may subsidize other work where that's hard to, to just get support for. A lot of times our policy work subsidizes the community organizing work because there's not as much money for that. And so I think there are many ways to look at how you're going to develop the money, but also how you're going to manage. And a lot of managing the money is also about how you develop that project. We use logic models so that we understand how much money is this going to take, how much time for each person, what time of the year or month are they going to be doing these activities, and what's the outcome. And so when you're able to have a strong, well-developed project with timelines, it also becomes easier to manage that money. The last thing you want to do is get to almost the end of the grant and you have spent money in a different way than you anticipated, or you didn't spend enough. And now the funder is going to say, well, gee, you've got X number of dollars left. This wasn't re-granted. What did you do? And to be able to also reach out to funders when necessary to say, we thought that we wanted to use 15,000 to do A, B, and C. But in doing that project, we understand that's really not the direction we should go into, or it's really not something that we now realize we need to do, and we'd like to use the money in this way. And again, that's something that funders are very open to having those discussions. So I hope I answered.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much. You went over everything from, some of that project, that grants management and the systems, but you also began to talk about project management systems, which was another big one that came up for folks. Many folks are asking, like, how do you actually develop a project? What are your project management systems? And you talked about, Peggy, the logic model, which makes tons of sense, especially when you have as many projects that an organization is managing as WEAC does. So Dwaign, let me turn to you for a minute. What's your sort of modus operandi behind how you develop and manage projects within your organization?
Manage projects or grants?
Projects. So the projects that you
Okay.
are applying for, grant funding to be able to implement.
Well, it depends on the grant.
Mhm.
Clearly, if a grant has a focus on building the missions, we will provide the necessary organizational resources to perform that task. But again, it's about having a different conversation with funders about what type of resources actually is needed to execute said grant. For example, it may be more coalition driven because we may not have all the expertise or the resources to execute said grant. It may be um yeah, so it's being able to integrate like different portions of our organizations, well as like youth organizing or a legal team. Like the way that I think ACE, my organization, is at its best is how we integrate different elements of our organization around one issue. Like we will look at an issue through a transportation lens, or we may look at an issue through a legal regulatory lens, and it may look at actual youth organizing community. How do we make it braided together? How do we integrate it and design it together to actually make a strong product? Because, you could get a grant and do like an average job on it, or you could provide some level of innovation on a project, and then that may be like a very powerful example for community, for funders, for the public sector. Like we did it in a different type of way that added value. So when we have a grant, we try to add a mixture of our services on on it to actually make it different from other different type of grants. Like if we're going to do it, we want to integrate our best services around that because as we talk about cumulative impacts, it's not one issue that impact our community. If we can hit it on multiple different levels, we believe that we will have a better product at the end of the process.
Thank you so much, Dwaign. So, just that idea of innovation, right? I think, part of this conversation around funding, right, is about having the type of resources you need to be able to innovate. Innovation does not come without mistakes. It doesn't come without trial and error. It doesn't come without iterations. So, what kind of relationships, coalitions, funder conversations do you need to be able to, have the room to design, to develop, to learn with your community, right? And I think that's a big part of this conversation. And then, at some point you begin to become skillful at it to the point where it's like you sort of see what's happening and you know how to move and you know how to put together the project. But I think what we see between these panelists is that there's a range of ways to do it, right? But what's most important is that you think about the bigger picture. You know, when we get stuck in sort of just the project or just the program, we may miss, you know, the opportunity to really grow out a new way of doing things, a new system within the organization. And so, you know, just all of these pieces together, I think, you know, are something like a recipe, right? So if each grant is a recipe, what ingredients do you have? You know, what ingredients do you need? That's sort of where we are, right? Is it that you have the ideas and you have the community buy-in, but what you need is, you know, a collaborative, you need the right models of engagement, or you need the right back office support, you know, that's going to be up to each organization to sort of evaluate what do we have and what do we need to be able to find success in this proposal for funding. So now we'd like to move into the Q&A portion of our panel, where we will ask you all to, you know, think about and drop into the chat any questions that you have for Dwaign and Peggy, you know, based on our topic, based on anything you heard, based on something you would like to hear about. Great. So I see that we already have some in here. And if it's okay with our partners behind the scene, I can just jump in. So we have a question. What are the best organizational structures of coalitions to implement and operate community-based initiatives, such as clean energy and sustainable affordable housing? So the best structures of coalitions. Any thoughts about that? I'll leave that one open.
You know, so much depends on the issue area, the theme, or the type of coalition. You know, if it's a regional coalition, do you have all of the regional geographic areas represented? Do you want to develop a coalition that's represented by a steering committee or by some sort of advisory board? A lot just depends on what your objective is. Again, is it a neighborhood coalition that's made up of key particular areas? Is it citywide or statewide or national? And so I think really understanding the objectives of that coalition as well. For instance, is the objective an advocacy campaign? That means you're going to have certain coalition partners, or is it some other kind of more community-based campaign, which means you're going to have certain other kinds of community leaders. So I think you really have to think about the purpose of the coalition and what it's organized around. What are the goals?
Thank you.
Yeah, real quick. It's also in coalitions, do you share the same values? Can you find, sometimes the emphasis is having big coalitions, and sometimes I always say that it's better to have a strong 5 than a weak 100. And if you could find the right combinations that could bring some technological tech policy support, legal regulatory support, base building, and also if the values are aligned. Because most coalitions fall apart, or many times coalitions may fall apart because the values are different. And I think the principles and values is like the cornerstone how you build out coalitions. Or you will, if you don't pay attention to that in the front end, it will really jam you up on the back end, especially when money start coming into the play and resources start coming into play. You know, sometimes people act a little bit different when they have resources on the line. So when you have really quality partners I think it go beyond the coalition. It go with a strong alignment of principal values, meaning we don't always have to agree, but we have to agree that certain things we just don't do. So yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dwayne, for talking, about the principled approach to coalition building. I think these are definitely gems here, about how you go about the things that you should be thinking about, as to the who, what, where, why, and when of coalition building. So we have a couple more questions. So folks, please do get your questions into the chat. We do have, about 18 minutes left. So there is time. So please get your questions in. So the next question is, how can local residents access these grants for community projects like neighborhood gardens and conservation activities? So this is a question from a resident. And I'd just like to ask that folks remain on mute, please.
Well, I'd say a lot of those kinds of grants are given by local community foundations and some of the smaller foundations. There's some that are focused just on gardens and open space. So need to do a little research online at the Foundation Center, or even looking at the 990s of other organizations that are doing the kind of work that you want to do, and finding out who's funding them is another way of really identifying funding for those kinds of local grants. Also, the city and the state often have grants for things like open space and gardens.
Thank you for that, Peggy. And
Also, real quick,
yeah,
I
please.
also, find like local organizations that doing similar work. Like, sometimes we don't have to rebuild the process. If you find a stakeholder in neighborhood, join that, learn how it actually works, and maybe then you could spin off and do something on your own. But community-based organizations are a great place to gain ideas and resources to kind of figure out what next steps you could do on your particular issue.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And, I think the common thread, between those two answers is it takes a decent amount of work, right? And research. And, sometimes, one thing I can definitely say about this panel and, these leaders here is that this is not, they get paid for this, right? People fly them all around the country, even all around the world, to talk about these type of things. So, please do, take this to heart. Please do follow up on what you're hearing here today. And for the next question, sort of building off of that one, there are folks who want to understand some of the barriers or obstacles that your organizations typically encounter when seeking federal funding. And I'm going to take it a step further, like what are the barriers and obstacles, and then how do you address them? Dwayne, you want to? Okay, go ahead, Peggy. Thanks.
Sure. Some of the barriers to seeking federal funds. Now, I must say that the Biden administration, the White House EJ Advisory Council, has pushed that these grants going out have got to be simplified, made less bureaucratic. So right now, you're facing probably half as many pages as you might have had to write, and a slightly simplified process. But let me say, I remember applying for an EPA grant, and they wanted an inventory of everything in our organization, whether it was supplies, Xerox machines. I mean, it was never ending. By the time we finished, we had paid our accountant to do something like 10 to 12 pages of this inventory. And this was just and this was probably 10 years ago, just to be able to apply for a certain kind of federal grant. You also need an indirect cost rate. Again, that indirect cost rate is put together by your accountant that looks at all of your operational costs. And then you submit that as an indirect cost rate to the federal government. And again, if you're applying for a federal grant and you don't have an indirect cost rate that has been negotiated and certified by the feds, you're losing money because those are operations monies that you could be getting back. So again, a lot of the barriers are simply not having had the experience. So again, talking to other groups that, you know, have a regular experience of working on federal grants is very helpful. When we first started out, one of my board members was a professor at a university, and he would come over after 5 o'clock and help us do the federal grants because, you know, he had some experience with that and we didn't. So again, believe me, there are going to be people who can help you do some of this, who can help you edit, who can help you think about how you develop the project. You just need to ask people in enough time. You can't call them and say next week, I've got to put this in. But there are people who want to help. And certainly there's volunteer expertise as well. I don't know if Morgan, if I might have left something out that you think would be critical.
I don't think so, Peggy, unless there's a specific component of it.
I guess the other thing with federal funds is that the proposals are generally scored. So
Yeah.
you've got to, there's no leeway with the federal grants. So you've got to really be clear about the question or the area that you're trying to address. And you've got to give them exactly what you think they're asking for, and you really need to understand what they're asking for. I think that becomes very important with federal grants. With a foundation grant, you have a lot more leeway. There's a lot more values and mission-oriented, you know, narrative. But with the federal grants, it's pretty cut and dried.
And I also think organizations have to be honest with themselves and say, are we ready to take on this federal grant?
Yeah.
Right? I think it is an evolution in many organizations to kind of ramp up to be able to have the capacity to take on federal grants. And one of my fears is that if you get caught in between not having the capacity and then mismanaging and get audited, it's real. That's a that's a place that you really don't want to be in, especially in this political culture of where we are now. So I think is having the honesty, like, hey, do we have it? Yes, okay, let's take a chance. If you don't have it, like, what do I need to do to build up to that capacity? And then what will it cost? Because it's a dollar amount relative to what it takes to manage a federal grant. And what Peggy was saying, they are trying to make it easier, but we are doing a strengthening community grant for Region 1. And if that's what they call easy, if that's what they call easy, then I don't want to see what hard used to be. So I'm just want to be real with folks. Is like they flash you big money, but you don't want to get caught not being able to manage those resources.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And, you know, I would also say that, you know, we all want general operating grants, but another thing that helps you get them is showing that you've done a couple of projects and done them well, and that you have a track record. And that's when you begin to get funders who, you know, you're new to, saying, okay, they've been able to do this on time, to have an outcome that they said they were going to have, and they've been able to manage that. And so then you find that people are ready to develop that stronger relationship and say, yeah, I think you're the kind of organization I want to give a general operating grant to, because there's a little bit more trust. There are intermediary foundations that are just focused on funding smaller groups, and they're very value laden. And I think everybody should do research on who those intermediaries are, because a lot of them are very focused on smaller groups, on organizing, and I think those are so many more than there ever used to be.
Thank you both for that. And, to the point about intermediaries, I think that's another, maybe in one of our future webinars, we could talk about, accessing those type of funds, because, these stepping stones have arisen, to help smaller groups engage in EJ and climate work. Many, I'm thinking about building equity and alignment for impact, as an intermediary. Climate Justice Alliance sometimes acts as an intermediary, and there are just many, many more. So, that could be a topic for, some future conversation here at the TCTAC. But we probably have time for a couple more questions. So some of them I see, the questions have already been touched upon by our speakers. So I'm going to look for questions that don't, yet have, where we might get some new information. So I see a question, as a small organization gets bigger, any advice on what back-end operations are good candidates for pro bono or volunteer labor, and which operations are better to contract out, and which are best to direct hire and keep in-house? So we're looking for back-end functions. Which ones are good candidates for volunteer pro bono work? Which ones are better to contract out? And which ones are better to keep in-house? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take a shot. You don't want an amateur plumber or electrician working on your house. So anything dealing with money, pay what you need to pay to get it right, right? Um, so your accountant has to be right. Um, like I would start off making sure if you're going to spend money, make sure that you have the financial controls to actually grow your organization, because that's literally the foundation of your organization is the fiscal controls. Um, and have something that could actually grow with you. But I could say one thing that I might want to kind of source, not source out, but kind of cut corners on is basically your accountant and your bookkeeper and your financial management.
So would you contract that person or hire them directly as a smaller organization who's beginning to grow?
I have done both, but the most important thing is the level of competency of the individual and of the firm, because you'll pay for it if you hire, contract out someone that's not tight in that role. You will have to spend significant money on the back end to correct it. So is this something to take very serious, whether you hire or you outsource it? Because we have an accounting firm that is outsourced, but and then you have to have a checks and balance on the accounting. Like you really have to take that process seriously, to make sure that when your audits comes or when anything happens, that you could account for every penny of your resources and how it's supposed to be spent. and restrictive and non-restrictive grants and all of these things are things that, to me, that either kill organizations or drive executive directors because it comes hard and heavy on you if you don't manage it.
Thank you. So we just have, so I'll ask my timekeepers, do we have time for one more question, or should we be wrapping up now?
It's your call.
Go for it.
So I'll take one more question from our participants. Let me find this one. So Peggy, do you want to take a crack at that one too? Which as the org gets bigger, which operations are good for pro bono, volunteer, which are better to contract out, and which ones are best to direct hire and keep in house?
That so depends. We've hired consultants for a business plan, for a strategic plan, and we spent months trying to get them understanding the work that we do. And we have hired in the past development grant writers who, again, you don't know the vocabulary, you don't know really truly understand community-based work. It's very difficult to have a consultant. But then, there's more of us now than there used to be. And so again, it's finding that right person. We've had a volunteer meet with us and say, I want to help you raise money. And I'm going to work with you 1 hour a week. And within a month, we had raised $200,000 from contributors who had been giving us money for years, but we never really asked them for much because we just didn't have a process. So, and that person was a volunteer for over a year and was just incredible. And it wasn't a lot of time, but it was telling us what we needed to do and being there to hold us accountable. So you can have really great volunteers as well. I think I've hired enough of the wrong people and wrong contractors and consultants that it's a bit of luck. But consultants can take a lot of your money and really not be the right ones. They've really got to understand what you are doing. And, we have an in-house bookkeeper and accountant, but we have an outside accountant because you need a check on, each one is a check. And you need somebody who's checking on the outside around, making certain payments for your benefits, doing other kinds of things that your in-house staff person might not do. But I would say that our in-house staff person is so good that on 2 days, we had 3 audits, a state audit, a federal audit, and a foundation audit. And those people were out of the office within 5 to 6 hours that same day. And 3 audits, and it was over the next day. That's how good the record keeping was, how good the preparation for those people coming in was as well. So that's where you need to be because you will be audited. And who wants a mess? Let's have everything there, organized. Yeah, makes a big difference.
Wow, wise words, wise words. So I see that we are at the top of the hour. And I want to thank everyone, particularly our panelists who've just given so much excellent information. To those of you who have put questions in the chat, all of your questions are recorded. There will be follow-up to this panel. So, and also, again, I encourage you all to engage with this TCTAC. If this is your first time coming on to a webinar, they all live on the WE ACT website. And there is, you can enter into contact with the TCTAC directly with technical assistance questions about your federal grants. So yeah, thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you, Dwaign. Thank you, WEACT staff, for all of your support. And thank you to all of our friends who joined us today. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Peggy. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Melissa. Wonderful. Dwaign, thank you.